There was a piano in the corner of the room. It had been there for years, long enough that nobody really looked at it anymore. The wood had gone dull. One of the legs had a crack running halfway up it, held together by nothing more than habit and luck. A few of the keys near the top had stopped making sound altogether. They went down when you pressed them, but gave back nothing. Like questions, nobody answered. The piano just sat there, taking up space, gathering a thin layer of dust on the lid, and the men who owned it did more or less the same. His name is not important. What matters is that he was 51 years old. He lived alone in a small flat on the second floor of a building that smelled faintly of other people's cooking, and he had not played that piano in close to 4 years. That is not quite true. He had sat on the bench exactly once, about 2 years prior, on a Sunday afternoon when the flat felt too quiet. He had lifted the lid, looked at the keys for a while, and then closed it again and gone to make tea. The kettle boiled. He poured the water. He stood at the window, drinking and watching the street below. And that was that. People who knew him back when he played would tell you he was good. Not famous. Not the kind of person who fills a concert hall. But good in a way that mattered. The kind of good that comes from actually meaning it. He had played since he was 7 years old, taught to him by his mother, who was not a trained musician herself, but who played by ear with the quiet confidence of someone who had been doing it since before memory. She would sit beside him on the bench, her hands folded in her lap, watching his fingers, and she never had to say much. He learned more from the silences between her corrections than from the corrections themselves. Music, for him, was never about performing. He played at small gatherings, sometimes a friend's birthday, a community evening, once at a little cafe that had an upright in the corner not unlike the one he would later own. But performing was not the point. The point was the feeling of it, the way a particular chord and a particular key could do something to the air in a room, the way his hands knew where to go before his brain did. It was the one place in his life where he did not have to figure anything out. His hands already knew. Then, over the course of about 3 years, several things happened. Not all at once. That is the thing about the kind of grief that truly breaks a person. It rarely arrives in one blow. It comes in stages, like water getting into a wall. You do not notice the damage until the wall starts to lean. His marriage ended. That was the first thing. It did not end in a dramatic, screaming way. It ended the way a fire goes out when nobody adds wood slowly, then all at once, with nothing left but the smell of smoke. His wife was not a bad person. He was not a bad person. They had simply grown in different directions for so many years that by the time they both admitted it, they were strangers sharing a kitchen. She moved out on a Thursday. He helped her carry the boxers. The second thing was his job. He had worked for nearly 18 years at a company that made specialist printing equipment, not glamorous work, but work he understood. Work he was respected for. A restructure came, the way restructures do. Dressed up in words like streamlining and going forward, I was let go. He was 50 years old, and he was let go, and the world expected him to update his profile on a job website and get on with it. He tried. He spent months trying. The interviews were polite and went nowhere. The third thing was his mother. She had been ill for 2 years by then. The kind of ill that does not get better, only slower. He had been driving to see her twice a week, sitting beside her bed, sometimes talking and sometimes just sitting, which she seemed to prefer, toward the end. She died on a Tuesday morning in February. It was cold. The window of her room had a thin skin of frost on the inside of the glass, and he noticed it right after, which is the kind of detail that stays with you for no particular reason, other than that your mind needed somewhere to put itself. After the funeral, he went home, sat down in the flat, and felt an absence that had no bottom to it. Not just grief for his mother, though that was there, large and real. It was more than that. It was the feeling that the last person who had known him from the very beginning, who remembered him at 7, sitting at a piano, learning to listen, was gone. There was no one left who held that version of him. He felt, in a way that is hard to explain without sounding dramatic, that a part of him had lost its only witness. He stopped playing after that. He did not decide to stop. He simply never started again. The months passed. He took some part-time work, nothing that needed much of him, which suited him fine because he did not have much to give. His sister called on weekends. He answered, said he was fine, which is a sentence that means almost nothing but which people say and accept because the alternative is a longer conversation. A neighbor he occasionally passed in the stairwell once asked if he still played, because she said she used to hear it and had liked it. He said no, not really, not lately. She nodded, and they moved on. The piano stayed in the corner. The dust stayed on the lid. The broken keys stayed broken. There is something worth saying here, and it is this. From the outside, his life did not look like a crisis. He was fed. He was us. He answered messages, paid his bills, went for walks sometimes, bought groceries. If you had looked at him on the street, you would have seen a quiet, slightly tired man of 51, and thought nothing particular about him. The kind of breaking that had happened to him had happened on the inside, in the places that do not show up when you are standing in a queue at a shop or nodding to a neighbor on the stairs. He had not fallen apart in any visible way. He had simply gone very, very quiet, and the piano, unplayed in the corner, was quiet with him. One morning, an ordinary Tuesday, no different from any other. He woke up earlier than usual. He did not know why. He lay there for a while, looking at the ceiling, and then he got up, went through to the other room, and stood in front of the piano. He stood there for a long time, long enough that the light in the room shifted slightly as the clouds outside moved. Then he pulled out the bench, sat down, and lifted the lid. He pressed one key. It sounded wrong, flat and buzzing, like a word said with a mouthful of something. He pressed it again. Same sound. He pressed a different key. That one was worse. He sat with both hands in his lap and looked at the keys for a moment. And if you had been there and watching, you might not have been able to tell whether he was about to start playing or about to close the lid for good. He pressed the key a third time, and then a fourth. He was not playing music. Not yet. He was just pressing a key, listening to a broken sound, and pressing it again. But he was there. He had sat down, and something about the fact that he kept pressing that key, despite how wrong it sounded, despite everything, meant that whatever had gone quiet in him was not, as it turned out, completely gone. It was just waiting, the way a piano waits, patient and still, in the corner of a room, for someone to come back to it. He did not tell anyone he had started playing again, partly because there was not much to tell. Pressing a broken key a few times in the early morning is not really playing. Ande no Italiano, but partly because naming it felt like it might break whatever fragile thing had started. Like if he said it out loud, it would become something he was supposed to do, and then it would stop being something he wanted to do. So he kept it to himself and just kept sitting down at the piano each morning. The way you might keep a small fire going by feeding it one piece of wood at a time and not talking about it too much. The piano sounded terrible. That is the honest truth of it, and it is worth saying plainly. Years of no tuning, a cracked soundboard, keys that stuck or went dead. It was not an instrument in any working sense of the word. It was an object that used to be an instrument. Playing it felt like trying to have a conversation with someone who only responded every third sentence. Frustrating. Sometimes almost funny, in a sad way. But he kept coming back to it. About 3 weeks in, he found a piano tuner through a small card pinned to the notice board at the local library. The card was old. The paper had gone slightly yellow at the edges and the phone number had a digit crossed out and rewritten in pen. He almost did not. He stood in the library looking at the card for a while, then took a photo of it on his phone and walked home. He called that evening. The man who answered was older, with a slow and careful way of speaking, the kind of voice that does not rush anything. He asked a few questions about the piano. How old? What make? When it was last tuned? What condition the keys were in? His tone was not alarmed by any of the answers, which was its own kind of reassurance. He said he could come on Saturday morning if that worked. It worked. When he arrived, he was exactly as his voice had suggested, an older man, unhurried, carrying a worn leather bag that had clearly been too many pianos over many years. He did not say much when he first walked in. He went straight to the piano, opened the lid, pressed a few keys, listened, pressed a few more, then crouched down and looked along the side of the instrument the way a doctor might look at something that needed attention rather than alarm. After a moment he said, quietly, almost to himself, "She's been through a bit, hasn't she?" It was not really a question. and something about hearing it said that way matter-of-factly, without judgment. Just a plain recognition that the piano had a history and that the history had been hard made the man who owned it feel, unexpectedly, a little less alone in the room. The repair took most of the morning. The tuner worked methodically, replacing strings, freeing stuck keys, patching what could be patched, being honest about what could not. He explained things as he went. Not in a lecturing way, but in the way a person talks when they simply find their work interesting and assume you might too. At one point he said that pianos, properly looked after, can last over 100 years. Then he said, without looking up from the keys, most things can really, if someone pays attention. He was talking about the piano. He might not have been only talking about the piano. By the time the tuner packed up his bag and left, the piano sounded like itself again. Not perfect. There were still 2 keys in the upper register that had a slight buzz to them. A flaw the tuner said was in the soundboard and would cost more to fix than it was probably worth. But it was close. It was close enough. The man sat down after the front door closed and played a single chord. Just 3 notes held together, and the sound filled the room in a way it had not in years. He sat with his hands on the keys and did not move for a while. The playing that followed over the next few months was not beautiful, not at first. His hands had the memory of it, but the feeling lagged behind. He would play a passage correctly, and it would sound technically fine and mean absolutely nothing. There were evenings when he sat at the piano for 20 minutes, and everything he played felt hollow, like going through the motions of something he used to believe in. He nearly stopped more than once. Not dramatically. He was not the kind of person who slammed a lid or swore at the ceiling. He just sat there on certain nights and thought, maybe this is not coming back. But then there were other nights. Nights when something clicked back into place without warning. When his hands found a phrase he had not played in years, and it came out whole and right and warm. When he stopped thinking about playing and just played. Those moments were not long, a minute, maybe 2. But they were real in a way that nothing else in his days had been real for quite some time. He started looking forward to sitting down. Not every session, but enough. Around this time, without any intention on his part, other people began to enter the picture. His sister, who had been calling weekly for over a year, started staying longer when she visited. She would sit in the armchair near the window while he played, not saying anything, just being in the room. She never made a fuss about it. She just stayed. He found he did not mind. There was also a boy from 2 floors up, 14 or 15 years old, the kind of teenager who looks like he has nowhere in particular to be and no interest in being there. He had started appearing in the stairwell at odd hours, not doing anything wrong, just sitting on the steps with his phone. Once, when the flat door was slightly ajar and the man was playing, the boy stopped on the landing. He did not knock or say anything. He just stopped and stood and listened for a minute or 2 before moving on. The man noticed. He said nothing. The next time he played, he left the door opened a little wider. That is not nothing. It might even be everything. A man who had gone so far inside himself that the world had become something happening on the other side of a window, quietly pushing a door open so that a teenager on a stairwell could hear music. It was not a grand gesture. It was just a door left open, but it meant that something in him had shifted from inward to outward, even if only by a crack. Several months after that first Tuesday morning when he had pressed a broken key in the silence of an empty flat, he played at a small gathering, not a stage, not a performance in any formal sense, just a community evening at a church hall nearby. The kind of event held in a room with folding chairs and a table of tea and biscuits at the back. Someone had asked him. He had surprised himself by saying yes. And now here he was. He played one piece. It was the piece his mother had liked most, one she used to hum when she moved around the kitchen, one he had played for her more times than he could count. He had not planned to play it. He sat down. His hands settled on the keys, and that was the piece that came. He did not play it perfectly. There was a stumble in the middle section, a place where his hands briefly forgot, and then remembered it kept going. When the last note faded, the room was quiet for a moment. That particular quiet that happens when people have actually been listening, not just waiting for the sound to stop. Then there was gentle applause, the kind that is warm rather than loud, and someone near the front said something kind that he did not fully hear. He sat at the keys for a moment, after, hands still resting there. He was not thinking about the applause. He was thinking about his mother, about her hands folded in her lap, watching him, about how she had put music in him so early and so quietly that it had survived everything. The marist had ended. The job that went, the grief that had no bottom. It had survived 4 years of silence and a cracked soundboard and keys that buzzed in the upper register. The piano was not the same as it had been. He was not the same as he had been, but they were both still here, which is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the whole thing. Some things do not heal back to what they were. They heal into something different, a little worn at the edges, a little wiser about silence, a little more careful with the notes that still work. The man knew this now in a way that had moved from his head down into his hands, which is the only place that really counts. He closed the lid that night gently, the way you close a book you intend to open again.